Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amy McPhie Allebest. Longtime listeners might remember back in season 2 when we interviewed Vanessa Loader about her decade of experience working on Wall Street. Vanessa told us that during those days, she, quote, cursed like a sailor, dressed in masculine-looking pants and sharp blazers, and once wolfed down a 7-inch Subway sandwich in under 7 minutes on a dare while senior partners cheered her on. She recalled that pulling all-nighters and working 100-hour weeks was normal and something to brag about, and that Wall Street was a work hard, play hard culture in which she excelled if she ignored the blatant sexism. These quotes paint a vivid picture of the environment women faced on Wall Street, even in recent decades. But of course, Vanessa wasn't the first. Generations of women had already been carving out space for themselves in a financial world that was explicitly built by men and for men. These women's stories are extraordinary and have too often been overlooked until now. Paulina Bren's newest book, She-Wolves: The Untold History of Women on Wall Street, uncovers the extraordinary histories of women who fought their way into one of the most male-dominated industries in America. These women endured exclusion, harassment, and impossible double standards, yet still managed to break barriers and redefine what power and professionalism could look like. But how did they do it? And why does it matter, not just for women, but for the health of our entire economy and culture? I'm so excited to dig into these questions with the author of She-Wolves, Paulina Bren. Welcome, Paulina.
Hello, I'm so glad to be here.
Paulina Bren is a writer, historian, and professor. She's the author of the critically acclaimed bestseller, The Barbizon, The Hotel That Set Women Free. Paulina teaches at Vassar College, where she is the adjunct professor of multidisciplinary studies on the Pittsburgh Endowment Chair in the Humanities and the director of the Women, Feminist, and Queer Studies program. Paulina's most recent book is She-Wolves: The Untold History of Women on Wall Street, and it was named one of the 10 best nonfiction books of 2024 by the Kirkus Review. And we'll be discussing this book today, as we said. And congratulations on that, Paulina. That's a great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Super exciting. I cannot wait to get into the content of the book, but I wonder if first you can just tell us a bit more about yourself personally, where you come from, just about what brought you to do the work that you
do. I go all the way back?
Oh.
All the way back. Well, I think I'm an example of you can always pivot at any point in your life, in your career. I was actually born in Czechoslovakia, behind the Iron Curtain back in the day when I was a toddler. The Russians invaded, and my family just randomly, because you didn't get to sort of figure things out and do them slowly, left quickly for the UK. So I grew up in England, but I've been in the US since mid-high school. And I entered academia as a scholar, a historian of Eastern Europe, of communism behind the Iron Curtain, because I wanted to write about the 70s and 80s, which no one had written about. I did that, and then I thought, well, I'm tired of this. I want to do something else. And I found myself, I'd always been a storyteller. I'd actually been a fiction writer. But I have the skills of a historian. And I found myself really interested in writing about American women in the 20th century. So my first so-called, non-academic trade book was The Barbizon, which was about the women-only hotel on the Upper East Side in New York, and it tells the story. And I'm getting to She-Wolves here, and it tells the story of the women, famous and not famous, who resided at this hotel, and especially the Barbizon especially tells the story sort of the Barbizon gal, who in many ways represents New York in the 1940s and 1950s. Even though the story is much longer, but that in many ways is what it tells us about ambition and thwarted ambition and so forth. And as I was finishing the book, I just became really interested in seeing, well, what happens after that? And, what kind of woman can represent really the 60s, 70s, 80s? And I found myself going to Wall Street to, as I named them, the She-Wolves. And it turned out, I knew nothing. It was a huge learning curve. I knew nothing about finance or Wall Street. I didn't know what I'd find there. I thought it would feel like an alien world, but it was interesting to see how pivotal this story was and these women's stories were really to our times, to those of us who have nothing to do with Wall Street. So that's really where I sort of landed, trying to continue that story that I started to tell before.
That is really fascinating. I'm curious also what your sources were as you were going into history that's relatively recent, but
Yeah.
yeah, how did you go about your research?
Well, that was also a shocker. I was already used to the idea from the Barbizon that when you write women's histories, sources are an issue
Hmm.
because often the sources you want, they don't exist. They've been thrown out along the way, not necessarily with evil intent, just this idea that women's history or those women are not important. And so that was certainly the case with the Barbizon. I sort of reconstruct the Barbizon through different sources, um, because all the guest registries and all of that, those letters, they don't exist anymore. So I was already used to that. And thus turning to Wall Street and even a more contemporary time frame. I mean, the She-Wolves is about the 1950s to 9/11 in 2001. So it's really the second half of the 20th century. But a lot of my characters are particularly coming in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So a fairly contemporary period, you could say. And yet the dearth of material. I mean, because it's contemporary, the first thing is right when you start a project, you Google, you see, okay, what's out there, what's been written, who's there, and so forth. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And just to give you an example, after that, after the first disappointing Google, I headed off to the New York Historical Society, which actually has an oral history archive they created about 10, 15 years ago
Wow.
called Wall Street 1950 to 1980. They interviewed 55 big shots from Wall Street, 50 men, 5 women. Not so surprising, those were the numbers. The
Yeah.
surprising part was when the men were asked, well, what about the women? They said there weren't any qualified women. There was nobody to hire. Therefore, I didn't hire women. It's not true. It's
Wow.
simply not true. And there are other examples. There's a really interesting book written about the ups and downs of Wall Street in the same time frame as I write about, and it's done through interviews in a very interesting way. 600 pages, 2 pages are an interview with a woman, and that is, of course, Mickey Siebert, who's the one woman some people have heard of from Wall Street. Otherwise, the other 500, 98 pages are all men.
My goodness.
So as I started to see this, it became obvious that there is a real issue of invisibility here. Even though these women not only existed, but they succeeded.
Wow. Yeah, that's even worse than I expected. I
Yeah, me
expected,
too. It was
yeah.
exactly that.
Wow. Okay. Well, I can't wait to dive into the book and hear these women's stories. But first, I just want to lay the groundwork. Um, I think there's a common idea that Wall Street was built by men and for men. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that for us. In what ways has Wall Street specifically excluded women, and why was it built that way?
Well, the fastest way to describe this is to point to the lack of women's bathrooms
Ah.
and the fight to have them installed. I actually talk a fair amount about bathrooms and she-wolves,
Mm-hmm.
because it was very relevant to these women. Um, the and it wasn't just Wall Street; it was Wall Street adjacent as well. Wall Street Journal, when women started to work there, there was a problem of just one tiny women's bathroom for maybe an occasional female visitor. Luncheon clubs, um, all of these places had barred women. So not only were they barred, so there were two issues. I mean, every single woman I spoke to who was of sort of the first two pioneering generations, every single one had an example of how a meeting was being held at a luncheon club or the Harvard Club, so forth, the Yale Club. And even if they were actual alums from that university, they would come to the door and the doorman would sort of just throw out his hand, not let them through the front door, and said they had to go around the back to the ladies' door, which was near the service entrance. In one case, one of the women, she had a very sympathetic boss who said, fine, then we're all going through the ladies' door. And he marched everybody through the ladies' door. But of course, that wasn't always the case. There's a wonderful story of a woman who was invited to give a talk, a keynote talk at a luncheon in a club, again, that would not let women in. So she literally had to climb the fire escape. The men had to help her into the room where she gave her talk, and then out she went through the fire escape again. So there was literal
Unreal.
barring of women. And then the whole issue of bathrooms. I mean, we'll probably talk about, as I said before, the one woman people have heard of is Muriel Mickey Siebert,
Mm-hmm.
who was really one of the iconic pioneers who arrived in 1954. And by the late 1980s, she was threatening the New York Stock Exchange that if they didn't put a women's bathroom on this particular floor where there was a special dining hall for members such as herself and other women by then, that she would literally call in porta potties. And so, so that all these stories are of trying to find a bathroom, on the trading floor, and like men get to trade and just run to a bathroom. Women have to go through multiple sort of floors and corridors. So when I say, women did not have access and Wall Street was built for men, I mean it quite literally.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, like you said before, it's usually not with evil intentions, right? Like someone's not designing a building on purpose thinking, "Ooh, let's make it really inconvenient for women." Right? It's the invisibility, right, of a patriarchal system where they
Absolutely.
don't expect women to be working, they don't expect women to be in finance at all, to even have capability to do finance. So it's just a world totally built for men not thinking about women, right?
Exactly. No, absolutely. And it's not even, yeah, it's not about evil intent.
Mm-hmm.
It's lacking at that time the imagination, the foresight to imagine a world where women could enter Wall Street, quite simply.
Yeah. Although, as I'm thinking of even, examples in my own life where there was just kind of maybe neutral, just kind of oblivion or ignorance more than bad intent. Sometimes, though, then when women do start to enter the space,
Yeah.
that's when sometimes you discover, like, oh shoot, there is misogyny in there. Like they
Oh,
they
yeah.
actually do believe that women don't belong. It's
Oh, yeah.
not
I
just
mean, I
ignorance,
think
right?
it's very hard to talk about Wall Street and not assume that there is a certain intent there.
Yeah.
If only to protect a certain cultural environment, which is
Mhm.
seen as somehow sort of central to the experience of making money, which is testosterone and sort of aggression and um, sort of you could say sort of that excitement, all of that is assumed is necessary for making money, and it's not necessarily the case. They've done studies where in fact often that sort of testosterone buildup, all of that actually fogs up the mind
Mm.
and does not allow for sort of the measured thinking that you sometimes need. So it's these mythologies also play off each other.
Yeah, for sure. So how did women start entering the world of finance on Wall Street? When did that happen? Who was it? How was it done?
Well, I'll I'll refer back to Mickey Siebert here for a second because she is the best known, but she took a path that was quite similar to women who would follow in the years after her. And I should say there was certainly she arrived in 1954 from Ohio in a beat up Studebaker, very little money in her pocket. There had been women on Wall Street before her. So I don't want to pretend like she was the absolute first one. And what's interesting also, there were periods of sort of historical time on Wall Street when women were seen as useful and they were present. So one example would be the 1920s before the crash, when everybody was investing money, including women. So brokerage firms would create these salons just for women where they could go and invest their money. They were made to look like, lovely, comfortable, sort of bourgeois living rooms, and they hired female brokers to be brokers in those women's salons. But they had nowhere to go after that, and after the crash, they were all ousted, the salons ended, and so forth. Then you see that pick up again in the 1950s, actually, even as women are pretty much barred, I mean, very much excluded from Wall Street after World War II. Wall Street is trying to, at the same time, sort of solicit their money for investment. So you have sort of, and that creates opportunity for women too, but in very sort of defined roles. But Muriel Mickey Siebert really took a pathway that a lot of women then followed simply because it was the way, the only way to get your foot in the door. And that was to come to Wall Street oft by accident. It was for these early women, it was not intent. It was literally coming to New York, needing to find a job. Clerical jobs were the jobs women had. Sometimes they paid a little bit better on Wall Street. So Mickey Siebert got a job as a sort of teletype assistant in the research department. Research departments were places where researchers would have certain industries that they were in charge of, like train, cosmetics, so forth. And they learned everything they could about the industry, which companies they would suggest to their firms, to their brokers at the firm, that they should tell clients to invest in. And so she was there just kind of running between the phone and questions from clients and from brokers to the researchers. And she's one of these women who started to pick things up, get interested. And again, it was often these women who started to climb the ladder. Not only did they see something here that they were interested in, but often it was a lucky accident. So, and that happened over and over. So in her case, when the senior researchers, when they were doing well, they were rewarded by being able to sort of shuffle off some of their work onto the youngsters. And the train guy did not believe in a future of airplanes and aviation. And so he handed that over to Muriel to sort of start to learn on. And she became an aviation expert at a time it exploded. So she became that. She was doing so. I should point out at this time, no major Wall Street firm was willing to hire women beyond the secretarial pool. So these women were coming into these little, at the time, Wall Street was so different from today. It was studded with hundreds of little brokerage firms. And they were more willing to hire women. Women could multitask, they were a lot cheaper. And and so she was jumping from one to another. But every time she gets somewhere, always her salary was going up. They bring in a young man and with no experience, and he'd make the same, if not more. And she was getting really sick of it. And she went along like this for about, 13, 14 years. And she was getting so frustrated. And a friend of hers who was a big deal in the go-go years in the 1960s on Wall Street, he said to her, why don't you buy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange and open your own firm, because you need to be a member. And you need to have a seat. And she said, well, I don't think you could. I'm a woman. I can't do that. He's like, I don't think it's in the Constitution. And it goes back to what you said. When the Constitution in the late 1700s was created for the New York Stock Exchange, I mean, it was a sort of a cabal of these guys who had been trading in that area, and they decided to sort of set prices and regulations. They did not exclude women in the Constitution because they couldn't imagine women. So
Mm-hmm.
she reads that and she realizes, wait, she can, and there's a seat available for like 450,000, which is the equivalent of 4 million today. And she decides to go for it. She needs a sponsor and she needs a bank loan. I won't go into how impossible that was, but she manages finally. And she gets, for her $4 million in today's money, she gets her little white and red enamel badge. And she officially becomes the first woman to have bought a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. But she does not use it to trade, which is why I usually buy it, because she knew she'd already done enough. She'd broken enough barriers. And she said that she already had enough enemies. She didn't need to go do that. That would be for somebody else. And indeed, it was until 1976 that the first woman actually went to trade on that floor.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, but she followed a pattern that you then saw these women in the 60s, the 70s following the same thing. And they were such an interesting group of women. These pre-1980s, when 1980 Wall Street explodes, it becomes a totally different universe. Prior to this, it's this almost quaint little enclave in the southern tip of Manhattan. And the women who come there who accidentally fall into it, they're a scrappy bunch of women. They are not these MBA, nothing of the sort. They tend to be working class, lower middle class, college dropouts, if they even start to attend college. Not all of them, but that was sort of a general profile. And they often had very complex backgrounds. And by the time they arrived on Wall Street in clerical positions, they had a tough skin, and that was really important. That was part of it.
This is reminding me so much of Mad Men, actually, if you've
I
seen
know.
Mad Men, right?
I
I was
know.
really surprised if listeners have seen Mad Men by Peggy's character, how she's right, like working as an admin in the office, just by luck has an idea, and then she gets a toehold and actually is able to work her way up in the company, but
Yes.
in against terrible odds and terrible sexual
Yes.
harassment and just horrific conditions, but she just finds an
Exactly.
opening and
And
makes yeah.
and also in the same way, one of the things, like, I knew there was obviously a story of constant sexual harassment, and by constant I mean throughout this timeline of 50 years. I don't
Mhm,
constant.
mhm.
Um, and I didn't want it to be the main story I was telling, but of course it's part of the story. You can't get away from that, and you shouldn't get away from that. But what I was not expecting, and now it seems so foolish, is the level of loneliness
Mm,
these
yeah.
women had, because they were always at the beginning, they were the only women in the room.
Mhm,
That was it. Their level of vulnerability was tremendous. Um, to have a mentor, if you're going to have a mentor, there were only men as
mhm.
mentors that were available. So immediately then the rumors would begin that you're sleeping
Yeah.
with him if he's your mentor. Um, and then women also told me that, you know, the the pinching of their backside was annoying enough, but what was really annoying, especially on the trading floors, was when the men who were so angry that women were there that they wouldn't trade with them. They would use their clerks as sort of go-betweens, like divorced parents. And that's the thing that the women said, when they were cut out of deals because men would not even talk to them, that hurt far more than anything else.
Mhm. Yeah.
It makes sense. And at the very beginning, the Financial Women's Association was created in the 1950s by the very few, sort of the handful of women on Wall Street. And they said, the originators said, in theory, it was to network the same way the men had the old boys network. It was start to build up the network. But the truth was, they had nobody to go to lunch with. And this way, they would have somebody to go to lunch with. So it
Yeah.
was that vast loneliness.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yes.
I can just imagine it. Yeah. So I would love you to just tell us some more stories from the book. Tell us maybe about a few of your very favorite she wolves. Um, I'd love to start with Marianne Spraggins, if that's okay,
Absolutely.
and or you can
Absolutely.
choose some more that you want to.
There are so many. And I should say, like, that I don't want to give the idea that it's just, a bunch of sort of anecdotal stories of women. Um, I interviewed a tremendous amount of women. Many are not in the book. I'd say about 20 show up in the book, but it's a handful that I really focus on. And the idea is that, yes, they have really crazy stories. Um, but at the same time, those stories are also speaking to a moment within the much larger history and trajectory of New York and Wall Street and women, and the workplace. So that was really important that they sort of link up in a way that's not just a bunch of stories. Marianne Spraggins, a perfect example of this. She's somebody, as I say, there's really this period, and then there's a tension among the generations, because there's this period of the 50s, but especially 60s and 70s, where these women are coming. And then this very new type of woman with the MBA and the college degree, Ivy League college degree, coming in the 80s. And there's a lot of tension between these groups. And Marianne Spraggins is somebody who right before Wall Street explodes in 1981, she's kind of sensing it. So she is a woman who is Black from a prominent Harlem family in New York. She's a lawyer, she's a law professor. There is no reason for her to go to Wall Street. But when she was doing her degree at Harvard, she took a course on international business, and they were taken into sort of the sort of the underbelly of Wall Street, sort of a little field trip. And she was mesmerized. She said that suddenly she understood power because of sort of the Harlem connections, the kind of family she'd grown up in. But here she was seeing a very different kind of power. And it was very prescient because at that moment, it wasn't that obvious, frankly. Wall Street had been on a real sort of down trajectory throughout the 1970s recession. Um, but she just sensed that, and she felt there needed to be a Black woman at the table.
Hmm.
And she quit her job as a law professor, and she wrangled her way, which in itself was a big deal, into the trainee program of Salomon Brothers. And amazingly, that year, I think it was the first year they even had any Black trainees, but they had five. They picked five candidates that year. She was one of them. But gradually, the others sort of were picked off, fell out, and it was only her. And the way these programs work is that they have lectures, they learn about everything. And as this is happening, different department heads are coming in to lecture about what they do, but they're picking off who they want. They have their portfolios, their photos. Everybody's been picked. Everybody has a department. Training is over. She still has nowhere to go. She's put together with this guy who's a complete racist to Salmon Brothers. It's funny, I've read elsewhere what a supportive guy he was. Not to Marion Spraggins, he wasn't.
Wow.
And they had just a blowout fight. And in that moment, she realized that, either she's got to make it big or she's going to go out there on a gurney. Like she cannot, there's no middle ground anymore. And that day she decided, instead of trying to be invisible about the shame of not being picked, she's going to just put it in everybody's faces. So she set up her office at a table in the cafeteria right next to the cash registers where everybody, including the executives, would get their breakfast. And she sat there just sort of inviting people to ask, hey, what are you doing here with all your stuff? And she sat there and people give her projects and so forth. And she was just determined. And one day she was told to go interview with this guy called Lou Ranieri for something called mortgage-backed securities, which nobody had heard of. Nobody knew what the heck it was. She had no idea what it was. He hired her. He was like, well, you sound like everybody else here. I'll just hire you. Well, she ended up being in the department that became the golden goose of Salomon Brothers. But her perseverance was insane, and her sense of where Wall Street was going and how pivotal it was going to be, and the fact that she wanted to have a voice there was fundamental to these otherwise very radical decisions that she made. Not, and she wasn't a spring chicken at that point either. So it was quite remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many, there's so many stories. There's Louise Jones is another favorite of mine. Also in the early 1980s, she had been found abandoned as a newborn in a phone booth on the Upper West Side. She was in the foster service. She was a foster child. The foster family, then adopted her. She didn't realize she was adopted. She in high school, but she was weirdly like, she was always after money. Even as a teenager, she had like a gazillion jobs. But she said to me, it wasn't the money; it was what came with it. Sense of security, a sense of power. And that was really important to me to write a book also about women who wanted power and money.
Mm.
And so in high school, and again, this is a couple of years after Marianne Spraggins begins. She's in a sort of a work, half study program in high school in Staten Island, and she gets a job, also I think as a teletypist at the New York Stock Exchange, and she arrives there, and it's so loud. In those days, now if you go to the New York Stock Exchange, it's like a sleepy shopping mall on a Monday afternoon. This was a time when there were like 3,000 people milling around screaming. It's so much noise, trash everywhere because you can't have garbage cans, trash cans because people, it'd be a hazard. So you just throw everything on the floor. So loud. And she said it was the first time she felt she could breathe
Hmm.
in all that chaos. And she looked around and she was like, I'm going to make so much expletive money here. And she did. And she did. So there were a lot of, just really interesting people who picked up on certain things in the time and the culture, and much of it was accidental, but some was sort of instinctively understood as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to pause there and ask about something that you just said, kind of in passing, that it was important to you to kind of tell those stories of women wanting
Yeah.
money and power, because I think that's really interesting. Because in our culture, I think we're taught, at least how I grew up, that that was unwomanly. It's unwomanly to want power and money. That's kind of a man's thing to
Yeah.
want. And so, how each one of these women grappled with that, and just with the stigma, it's I mean, it's like other fields where women were new and entering and men were there was resistance there, but in some ways it's unlike other areas for its like extreme
It's extreme.
unfemininity.
Yeah, exactly. I know the whole thing about money, also the sense of it being unseemly and therefore
Yeah.
unfeminine,
Yes,
right?
yes. Mhm.
Um, I, I, it's interesting. There's one woman who was a very aggressive trader, and she said that all the characteristics she'd always been punished for as a girl worked in her favor in finance as
Mhm.
a trader, and she was rewarded handsomely for it.
Mhm.
And that was exciting to her,
Mhm.
to be able to act that way and not just be told that you can't, you're not acting in a ladylike fashion, but to be rewarded so handsomely for it was a phenomenon. I think a lot of these women experienced. Um, Also, I have to say, especially the early women, when they were entering, the women in the 50s, 60s, 70s were entering an extremely brash culture in a different way than the 80s. The 80s were very brash too. And they were, coke filled and sort of, uh, yeah, it was a different kind of brash. But the women who were really isolated, who were alone, in order to survive, consciously and unconsciously, they would have to act like men. And a lot of women said to me, especially like Alice Jarko, who ended up being the first woman to actually trade on the New York Stock Exchange floor in 1976. And by then she was still very young, but she was a veteran of Wall Street. And she was loud-mouthed, I mean, four-letter words out of her mouth. She was often horrified by what she'd become. And in fact, when people who'd been talking to her on the phone for years would meet her, they'd be shocked because she was this young, pretty, diminutive woman. And they never expected that because of the way she acted. So women did often talk to me about how they'd had to adjust to that.
Mhm.
But the whole thing about making money, oft, I made sure to ask the women I interviewed about that, and I found that they often said the the money was gravy. A lot of it was the power. It was the power that came with it that was enticing.
Yep.
And also, they tended not to spend the same way men did.
Hmm.
For them, it was about knowing that they'd created security for their family, if they had one. That's a whole other issue. But if not family, I mean, for their parents, for their siblings, that they were in a position where they could help anybody. And
Yep.
that's often how they treated that money, as sort of this security blanket, this enormous buffer they had created in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to talk more about the families? About, you say that's a whole other issue, and indeed it is. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yes. So the early women, there were exceptions, but the early women felt they didn't have a choice. It was having a family or it was having a career. There was no in between. The women who came sort of young in the late 1970s into the 80s, they were trying to figure out how to have both. Um, and talking to each other about it, how to do it, recognizing the compromises, recognizing they had the funds in a way a lot of other working women didn't. So they could afford to have nannies. But then the question was, there are so many weekend events, so many evening events. I mean, it also really often became a question of which sector do you go into if you want to have a family. There's sectors where you couldn't say goodbye at 5 p.m. It
Mm-hmm.
continued well into the night, right? So there were a lot of questions, but I think what's one of the interesting things that, for example, Maureen Sherry told me, and she was at Bear Stearns, and she's this tall, beautiful blonde, and she would always sort of be showcased as you can have it all at Bear Stearns because she um, she actually had 4 children in a row. Every single time she said she's coming back, because she'd come back, or actually friends of hers would report to her that they've already put somebody in her chair. So she'd have to wrestle her clients back after that. So every single time. But what she said was, and it speaks so much to even that moment when women feel they can have it all. So she said that the men would always display pictures of their wife and their kids on their desks in the trading room. Proud, virile, and of course, mostly the wives were at home, right, because they were making so much money. And these women who had children, who were also in the trading room, also had desks, they wouldn't dare showcase that.
Mm-hmm.
They could not afford to present themselves as mothers, even though, Maureen had 4 children at home. It was something you were still hiding. It was still, and even if everybody knew about it, it's just something you did not want to identify as. Whereas the men, of course, that was a plus, right? It was a plus that you're so virile that you've had those 4 children.
Right. Yeah, that's a double standard. I mean, it would be shocking, but I'm like, yeah, of course I get it.
Of course,
I
no,
wouldn't
exactly.
show my kids pictures either. People
Exactly.
wouldn't take you seriously.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, when I've given talks, I always emphasize this book is, in many ways, it's a story of women entering the workforce
Yep.
from the 1950s to the present.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is not to say that Wall Street, as you said, I mean, yes, Wall Street is sort of a, oomphed up Uber version of all
Mm-hmm.
of this, right?
Yeah.
But even when in academia, when in the late 90s, I'm sure the early 2000s too, when you were on the job market as a woman with a PhD or finishing a PhD, you were told to take off a wedding ring if you had a wedding ring.
Hmm.
If you were pregnant, and often like the women on the job market, they're in early pregnancy because they've put off having children throughout graduate school because they're told they shouldn't have kids in graduate school. The amount of tricks that were used to hide that you're pregnant,
Hmm.
um,
Wow.
all of this is a story that is not just about Wall Street. It's
Yeah.
not just about the she-wolves. It's about all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I've even been told that. I remember when I was thinking about going back to graduate school, which I did after my 4 children were a little bit older. And I was talking about like, how do I present myself when I meet that it was like the first time
Mhm.
that I would be meeting, advisors and people. And they said, well, tell us about yourself. the person asked me to tell them about myself, and I said, well, I have 4 children. And they go, oh, I wouldn't lead with that.
Yeah.
And it was really, really, yeah.
Yeah.
And I understood why I did, but my husband for sure could have said that first.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
and I would like to encourage men to do that. I'm happy that the men had pictures of the families in their offices,
Yeah, absolutely.
but
We just want
but
those pictures
everybody should
too.
be able to. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And these things have changed everywhere.
Mhm.
I wouldn't say they've disappeared everywhere, but
Mhm.
they have changed. At the same time, uh, readers of She-Wolves who are young say that they identify
Mhm.
what's with the story that's being told here. They can see themselves in it
Mm.
too.
It's discouraging to hear that.
I know.
Yeah. Okay, I want to kind of go back to a topic that we maybe discussed a little bit with the money and power. I want to ask specifically about capitalism because on our podcast, we talk about patriarchy and capitalism being interlocking, oppressive forces in society. They're deeply interconnected. And so I'm wondering, with that connection in mind, um, why, if we are working within a capitalist system, which we are, why is it important for women to be present in our financial institutions? And it seems like that came up with Marianne Spraggins also, right? Like that she said,
Yeah.
I need to be here in the room where it's happening in order to exert influence. Can you talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit more?
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. So I think even if you don't agree with neoliberal capitalism, which I'm certainly not a fan of, um, and you don't agree with what Wall Street represents, you want women there.
Mm-hmm.
You want diversity of all kinds there. Um, so even if, let's say, women and people of color and queer folk who are on Wall Street and all those people on Wall Street, even if they buy into the promise of neoliberalism, I think their experiences inevitably offer an entryway into seeing things a little bit differently.
Hmm.
So you need multiple perspectives to make good decisions. And what's really worrying to me is that, well, these days there's so much worrying me, but
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that's worrying me is that private equity, which is sort of really the thing now in many ways, and Silicon Valley, the tech industry, they're leaving out women.
Mm-hmm.
So they might have a cool vibe happening, but it often feels like the 1950s all over again, which is why the She-Wolves feel so relevant to me. Because when you read these stories of, that the book that came out, I think the woman who worked for Facebook and that Zuckerberg was trying to make sure didn't come out, but of course that created even more publicity for it.
Mm-hmm.
Those experiences, I mean, we're seeing a throwback. And in fact, when I spoke to the women of all these generations, when I would ask about um, progress, they would say, "Yeah, there's been progress. There are lots of women in sort of high level middle management, but if you look at the very top, the numbers are terribly sad. 10%. That's sort of what you're looking at." And the fact that the most sought after industries are private equity and tech and AI, probably now, that you're not seeing women there for the most part is very troubling to me. So, regardless of what your feelings are about capitalism, we live in it right now. And the idea that it's again going to come down to sort of men and men of a certain class and of a certain ethnicity and a certain sensibility is very troubling.
It brings to mind the quote that you share from Gloria Steinem near the end of your book, where she says, we'll never solve the feminization of power until we solve the masculinity of wealth, right? Um, Yeah, that kind of encapsulates what you're
It does,
talking
though.
about.
I have to say, when I first came across that, because it's something that uh, those women, there were a number of women who prospered, who did very well in finance. They retired, and not because of their age. They just retired. They had enough money in many cases and wanted to do something different. And they are leading sort of the call for financial feminism. And but and they're the ones who sort of looked to Gloria Steinem's quote, and I puzzled over it for a little bit. I wasn't entirely sure what it meant.
Hmm.
What I would say it means is that the what you started with, the notion of money, of making money, of the power that comes with it, is seen as something that men do, as the masculine domain, right? Um, and so, what these women who work in financial feminism call for is they advocate that basically women vote with their money, that they invest in ways that help other women. And it's actually an idea that's quite similar to one that was propagated from like the 30s to the 50s by a woman called Willa Soss, or Sosa. Um, and it was for her, it was less of a feminist mission, but still somewhat. But she was trying to show sort of people who invest that, in fact, they own the company and they have power to make change. And so financial feminism is taking this in sort of in a even more sort of feminist perspective. And I'd say it's a tricky question, because it goes back to when women got the vote, the actual vote. Um, and suffragettes had always hoped and planned that once women got the vote, they would vote in their own interests. And that
Mhm.
didn't happen. They didn't vote as a bloc, as a sisterhood, you could say, to use an old fashioned term. They voted often as their husbands voted, or voted along different sensibilities rather than some sort of women or woman oriented sensibility. And I do worry about financial feminism in that same way, where we might keep telling women, this is, you could help by thinking about how you invest. But I think similarly, there are problems there, because, first of all, most of us, let's face it, are not that keenly tuned to how we're investing, if we're
Mhm.
investing, right?
Mhm.
So I think it can get quite difficult. I would say, I mean, buy from women-owned businesses if you can. That's some element of that. But I am still, having said all of that, I'm glad that there is this idea of financial feminism, that you can, because it ultimately, money is power. So you really could, in theory, make change through deciding where your money goes, right? I mean, that's
Mhm.
something we all understand in terms of boycotts and so forth.
For sure. And it depends like what group you're talking to. I come from a conservative religious background. That was the environment in which I was raised. And I know multiple women. I've had conversations with women I know who were in abusive marriages who didn't leave, is the very basic level. They couldn't leave because it's like it was 200 years ago. They had no way of supporting themselves and their children. And so,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, statistically, still, women take such a fall financially when they get divorced.
Yep.
And so there is something a little rarefied about the notion of financial feminism,
Hmm.
frankly, from my perspective.
Hmm.
So it's a tricky thing in thinking about, where can we go with this? And again, I would talk to women and say, well, what about diversity? What about equity? And they would roll their eyes and say, oh, I was on these committees. I headed these committees, all these committees that were initiated by all the big firms on Wall Street. But they were gestures.
Hmm.
I think, and so they would roll their eyes because they've become disillusioned with those as
That's too
well.
bad. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember going back to Maureen Sherry, who told the story of the photos of the kids, or lack thereof,
Mhm.
on the desks of the women with kids. Um, she told the story also of when Bear Stearns changed CEO, and there was a real emphasis on Wall Street because they didn't want to get sued, because civil action suits had started. That's a whole other thing. Um, so the CEO, HR decided the CEO should meet with all sort of top level women from different branches of Bear Stearns all over the country and talk about these issues. So they would have these meetings, and she went into hers all like revved up. They get there, and this is a classic scenario. There's a tape recorder in the middle of the desk, it's already running. HR is run by a woman who is not on the side of women. And the new CEO is sitting there while the women are talking and trying to express their experiences. He's not listening, he's taking calls, he's putting out his cigar in an ashtray which says Financial Women's Association, the one I talked about at the beginning that was founded in the 1950s. And when women would talk about something that happened, he'd say, "Sounds like your problem." So that was, so on the one hand, you had these
Ugh.
diversity, equity committees. On that hand, you had the reality.
Right. Right.
And that's a harsh truth, but
Yeah.
it's very much part of the story.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm so glad you point that out. And it's just good to remember that that is, like you said, that's the reality. And it is moving forward, even if it's sometimes stepping back and sometimes stepping sideways, and it's frustrating. But those doors being opened are real, and it is
Absolutely.
making
That's the
progress. Yeah.
thing. I mean, this is very, very true. And the story of She Wolves, it's, it's, it's depressing sometimes, but it's really inspiring. And
Yeah.
also, honestly, it's funny a lot of the time in a tragic comedy sort of
True.
way. I mean, it really is because of the absurdities that take place and the way the women would get so clever at sort of getting past these obstacles. And you often had to really outwit everybody. You had to be cleverer than everybody else to outwit was what the other people and what was put in your way. So some of that tends to be very amusing and inspiring.
Yes, for sure. Definitely. I think listeners will find it incredibly inspiring, and such fun to read.
Yeah.
Such a fantastic book.
Oh,
So, and that is bringing us to the end of the conversation. I'd love to ask you as my um, almost final question. We're centering action this season on our podcast, and so we like to end each episode talking about what listeners can actually do to help create positive change. So I'd love to ask you if you have any action items that you'd be willing to share with us.
well, what I would say, I'm not sure it's something we can do, but we can work toward it. Well, I was thinking of this analogy recently. So, well, okay. So Wall Street is a very secretive world. It was hard to get these women to talk. The reason they were willing to talk is because they wanted the women who came after them and who are in that world now to understand they're coming out of a legacy. There is a legacy, there's shoulders that they're standing on. So I think that's really important to recognize that you didn't just, if you graduate from college and you go to finance now, you're not just being plopped in there. There's a whole, almost century behind you of these amazing women that you're now a part of. And I think you need to recognize that. And I think
Yeah.
it's helpful to recognize that. And as part of that, I was thinking, there's sort of an analogy. I don't know if you've discussed this on your podcast, but certainly we discussed this in our women feminist queer study courses. Um, we often hear about how medical students to this day are not taught about women. They're not taught about menopause. They're still often taught that Black women feel less pain, which is why pain management for Black women when they're in labor and surgeries and so forth tends to be less than it should be, because this is what they've been taught, or they haven't been taught, right? And I'm in the same way. I really think in business schools, men and women who are there need to be taught. And again, we're starting with the incredible erasure and invisibility of these women. When I started the project, there's no history. In fact, I think there's a I haven't seen it. There's a documentary on Netflix running right now, a new one called Titans, which takes you through all the titans of Wall Street. And I doubt I'll see, but I doubt they mention any women, because this just continues this erasure. And I think that in the same way, if those who are doing business school or business studies, they need to be taught about this history, that they're not just this isolated money making in this money making environment, that it has a history, it has structures, and it has experiences that you might recognize. So when you're in that, you might actually recognize something that you maybe read about and you didn't feel that comfortable with, and you see it happening, you see yourself repeating it. So I think in that sense, the understanding fundamentally that we need to know the histories of women as much in medical school as we do in business school and other professional fields. And I think that to get rid of a lot of these nonsensical ideas we have about women or the invisibility of women. As I say, when these men were asked, were there women? They were like, no, there were no women, when there were. And it's simply a fact.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say I would like to see everyone aim for.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, and in that way, I mean, reading the book it's a meaningful act to know accurate history, to bring women's voices back in. And so thank you. Thank you for writing the book.
Well, thank you for having me here.
Yes, yes. I'm just thrilled to know this information and to share the book. So where can listeners go to learn more about your work and then and find a copy of the book?
For me, just go to paulinabren.com. With the book everywhere. If you don't want to go near Amazon, understandably, but you can. I would do not judge. Um, Bookstores, Barnes and Noble, even any actual bookstore. It should be there. If it's not, order it. It's really everywhere. So, and the paperback, is coming out September 23rd. I don't have a copy yet, but I got myself this lovely bag with
Ooh.
the new cover for
Ooh,
the
I love it.
paperback. And I should say, I have always every time I write a book about women, the first draft of the front cover is pink. And
Oh,
I
how
always have
fun.
to push back every time. So I have,
Wow.
as a result, it somehow ends up green all the time.
Huh.
But now for the paperback, I was like, okay, now let's just do pink.
We
That's
can
fine.
do pink. Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
Yeah,
How
exactly.
interesting. I
Let's make
love it.
it pink.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, well, I love it. I like the look of it too. So, oh,
great.
that's wonderful. Well, again, the book title is She Wolves, The Untold History of Women on Wall Street. And again, Paulina Bren, thank you so much for being with us today. I learned so much from you.
Thank you so much.